Okay, so welcome everyone. So glad to see you all joining us today for the session about research efforts to establish ketamine and psychedelic therapy in Canada. So in terms of how this session will run, we will have both of the presenters give their presentation first, and then we'll save some time for questions and discussions towards the end. You can always put in the chat your questions as they're presenting, but we'll make sure we have some time to get to those at the end. So Dr. Husain is the lead of the Mood Disorder Service in General Adult Psychiatry at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, as well as the head of the Clinical Trials Unit at the Campbell Family Health Research Institute. Dr. Husain is also an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and a Canada Research Chair in Treatment Innovation in Mood Disorders. Welcome, Dr. Husain.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Tatiana, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on Canadian research efforts in psychedelic therapy. And the focus of my talk is going to be on research efforts at my center in Toronto, at CAMH, looking at the potential of psilocybin as an emerging intervention for the treatment of major depression. I will just start by talking about my disclosures. I have no conflicts of interest, only to say that I was contracted for research by Compass Pathways to lead the Canadian site for a large phase 2 study of psilocybin, which I'll be talking about today. So what I will be spending the next 10 to 15 minutes doing will be to evaluate current evidence on the antidepressant effects of psilocybin. And I will then conclude by providing an update on psychedelic science research efforts at our center at CAMH and how we are hoping to move the needle towards the clinical translation of psilocybin as a treatment option for depression. So as many of you may be aware, psychedelic drugs like psilocybin are being heralded as a new frontier in the treatment of mental health conditions, including depression, which is the leading cause of disability worldwide. These are just some select headlines from mainstream media outlets like the New York Times, The Guardian in the UK, talking about how magic mushrooms could be really a new frontier in the way that we approach the treatment of depression. And I think some of these headlines have created a hype, but I also think a lot of the excitement around the use of these treatments is related to the fact that there is a substantial group of patients with depression that do not respond to our currently available treatments, and we really do need to be investing time and effort and money into the investigation of new ways to help these people. So what exactly is psilocybin? It is a tryptamine alkaloid, which is found in several species of the psilocybe mushroom. Essentially, it is the chemical component of magic mushrooms. It is a prodrug for psilocin. And it has been used for centuries across cultures to induce a hallucinogenic experience. In terms of clinical research, this began in the 1950s after Albert Hofmann isolated it from a psilocybin mushroom. It was actually marketed as a medicinal product by Sandoz, a Swiss pharmaceutical company. And at one point, research of the use of psilocybin and LSD in clinical populations in mental health and addictions really flourished. At one time, the NIH funded over 120 different studies in the 1960s, but this all came to an abrupt halt in 1971 when these were classified as Schedule I substances without actually substantial evidence that they caused harm. And so this really impacted our efforts as a field to investigate these as treatment options in depression and other mental health conditions and addictions. I think there have been some sessions already, including Dr. Gobi's session on the pharmacology of psychedelic drugs. But essentially, the classic psychedelic drugs are considered to be quite potent serotonin 2A receptor agonists. So they activate that receptor, but they also have actions at other serotonin receptors, such as 5-HT1A and 5-HT2B as well, where they have agonist or partial agonist activity. But we know that it's the 5-HT2A agonism which produces the quite profound psychological effects that are associated with psychedelic drugs like psilocybin. And these psychedelic effects include feelings of connectedness, euphoria, improvements in mood, cognition, and an array of different effects. We know that the 5-HT2A agonism is what's responsible for the psychedelic effects, because studies in humans have shown that by blocking the 5-HT2A receptor with an antagonist such as ketanserin, which is an antihypertensive, or risperidone, which is an antipsychotic, you can totally eliminate the psychedelic effects that have been associated with drugs like psilocybin. MDMA, which is often sort of put under the same umbrella as a psychedelic drug, acts a little bit differently from the serotonergic psychedelics. It causes the presynaptic release of serotonin, as well as norepinephrine and dopamine. So I'm not going to go and spend too much time on the psychopharmacology of these drugs and the pharmacokinetics, but I will say that over the last 10 to 20 years, there has been a resurgence of research in the use of psilocybin as a novel treatment for mental disorders. This you can see from this timeline here that between the early 60s and the 90s, there was an absolute cessation in research. And then in the US, there was preliminary studies showing potential benefits in clinical populations, including OCD, end-of-life distress, substance use disorders like tobacco and alcohol use. And then there was a seminal study in 2016 in treatment-resistant depression, published by Robin Carhart-Harris, Dave Nutt and colleagues at Imperial College, showing that in 19 patients with quite severe and refractory treatment-resistant depression, psilocybin combined with psychological support led to substantial improvements in mood symptoms. And this is just another slide summarizing some of that data. Data from populations with end-of-life distress as well as treatment-resistant depression, showing quite powerful and sustained antidepressant response rates. For instance, looking at the TRD study in 19 patients, the population was quite severe. Most had failed at least 4 treatments. And had been ill for quite a long time, almost 18 years. But psilocybin combined with psychological support led to a response in 63% of patients at week 1, almost 50% at 5 weeks, and almost a third were on no medication or therapy a year later. So clearly, very promising signals for psilocybin-assisted therapy as a treatment for depression. And then this led to a slew of papers published recently. This was a paper published in Gemma Psychiatry in 2021, showing that compared to a waitlist control group in a sample of around 27 patients with major depression, not necessarily treatment resistant, psilocybin-assisted therapy led to substantial improvements in depressive symptoms compared to that waitlist control. Just to speak to the sort of attention that this study received, this was the most read and downloaded study on Gemma Psychiatry's website in 2021. So really showing the interest in the need for new treatments for depression, but also the potential of psychedelic drugs. And then a few months later, Robin Carhart-Harris, Dave Nutt and colleagues at Imperial College published a study comparing psilocybin to a first-line treatment for depression, escitalopram, at 10 milligrams. All participants, which there were 59 in total, also received psychological support. And although they were able to not differentiate statistically significant differences in their primary outcome of depressive symptoms as measured by the QIDS patient-rated measures of depression. They found that adverse events were very similar. Psilocybin was well tolerated, and actually on a few secondary measures, psilocybin performed better than escitalopram. So, for instance, in symptoms of overall well-being, psilocybin, those receiving psilocybin-assisted therapy did better than those receiving escitalopram. I will say that the caveat to this is that in terms of the analysis of the secondary measures, there were some issues with that, and in the presentation of that data, because they weren't controlled from multiple statistical tests that were applied. So I will say, though, that there remains very compelling evidence for antidepressant and mood-enhancing properties for psychedelic drugs, and psilocybin is probably the one that has been most investigated, at least in patient populations with depression. This is data, really pooled data from multiple studies in healthy volunteers and patients showing the mood-enhancing effects of psychedelic drugs, including psilocybin. So psilocybin by itself in healthy individuals has quite a large effect size of almost 0.7 in terms of its mood-enhancing properties. And in patient populations, again, similar effect size of around 0.63, showing that it can improve mood symptoms. And then this is the effect of psychedelics on depressive symptoms. Again, if you look at psilocybin alone in patient populations, you will see that it has a very large effect size of almost 0.826. Now, you compared this to pooled evidence of the effect size of antidepressants that we currently use. The pooled effect size is between 0.3 and 0.4. So psilocybin is almost double that in terms of its antidepressant efficacy. Again, the caveat is that any meta-analysis is only as good as the studies that it pools together, and there have been substantial limitations in the studies that have been conducted thus far. So how would psilocybin cause antidepressant effects? The answer is that we don't fully understand. It could be due to the direct 5-HT2A agonism. It could be due to a biopsychosocial spiritual downstream effects of that quite potent and powerful mind-revealing experience. It could be due to other biological actions, such as increased BDNF expression and neuroplasticity. Dr. Gobi spoke about in her talk about changes in the default mode network, which is known to be quite active in internalizing disorders like depression. But also psilocybin has shown to have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which we know are also associated with antidepressant properties. Given the issue with some of the clinical trial designs, it could be also an aspect of a placebo response and expectancy that's playing an effect. But once we look at and critically appraise all of the clinical trial data that's coming out, we would have to appreciate that some of the data is limited by methodological issues. I co-led a consensus statement from the Canadian Network for Mood and Anxiety Treatments, which is the leading think tank in terms of mood and anxiety treatments in the country. And we found that there is currently only low-level evidence to support the efficacy and safety of psychedelics, serotonergic psychedelics for the major depressive disorder. And as such, we would recommend as a group that psilocybin, for the time being, remain considered an experimental treatment until some of the issues in clinical trial design have been addressed. However, we do recognize that access, rarely through the special access program, should be considered. So I spoke about some of the limitations with current studies. Those include small sample sizes. A lot of people come in with a lot of expectations that this is going to be a transformative treatment, and that could be playing a role. Blinding is an issue that I'm not sure that we'll be able to get around, at least in the short to medium term. And in all of the published studies of psilocybin in depression, at least, the majority of participants were able to correctly identify the treatment allocation they were randomized to. It's very difficult to adequately control for the powerful psychological effects associated with psychedelic drugs, and that's an issue that limits current studies. But also, a lot of the samples have been very homogeneous, mostly white middle-class participants, highly selected groups with very stringent eligibility criteria. And I'm not sure that would apply to the patient population I see in a melting pot like Toronto, where 54% of my patients are not from Caucasian backgrounds. Also, we don't know about the longer-term efficacy and safety. Most of the studies have been quite short in duration. There is no current assessment of dose response, although I think the COMPASS study that I'll be presenting will address some of that. No assessment of the fidelity of the psychotherapy. And again, there's very limited understanding of how the antidepressant effect actually occurs. Other issues that we have to be aware of as a field is that the highly attentive psychotherapy is involved in this intervention. And most studies it's around 14 to 16 hours of psychotherapy, and that undoubtedly may be confounding some of the results. We've also got quite highly motivated patients that want to put themselves forward for these studies. The therapists involved are also very highly motivated, and there are highly motivated funders and sponsors as well. And again, it's just an acknowledgement in the field that these are potential issues that we need to consider. So I'm going to talk about some of the Canadian research efforts, and I'll conclude with the fact that we at CAMH led the Canadian site for the largest phase 2B dose finding study of psilocybin as a treatment for major depression. And this was a sample that was experiencing treatment-resistant depression. In terms of our psychedelic treatment experience, we had 4 screening visits where we carefully assessed an individual. We tapered medication, and we also provided preparatory psychological support, in which we provided psychoeducation on what the psychedelic experience would encompass. And then we had a non-clinical setting. We had a music playlist for a 6 to 8 hour dosing session in which 2 therapists were present, of whom at least one was there with the patient at all times to provide monitoring and support. Following this, we had 1 session of integration as well with each participant in this study. So this was the overall sample, including the participants that were recruited at CAMH. You can see that from their baseline depression symptom scores, they were quite a severe group of patients with around a score of above 30 on the MADRS, which is moderate to severe. And you can see that, again, it was rather a treatment refractory sample, with most having failed 2 and quite a large number also having failed 3 or 4 evidence-based treatments for major depression. And these are our results, quite encouraging, I would say. So in that we assessed 3 different doses of psilocybin, 25 milligrams, 10 milligrams, and 1 milligrams. We found that the 25 milligram dose statistically significantly led to higher chances of a response and remission compared to the 10 and 1 milligram doses. And that was at the primary endpoint of 3 weeks following the dosing session. So again, very encouraging results for a single dose intervention for treatment-resistant depression. This is just a schematic showing the trajectory of MADRS scores across each group. You can see here that the 25 milligram group clearly separates from those in the 1 and 10 milligram groups at all time points in terms of response and remission. So one of the issues from the paper that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine was that people were quite concerned about the number of adverse events. Overall, I would say that the adverse events on the dosing day, which is day 1, were mild and transient. We did have some severe adverse events, but they were more related to, I would say mild physical symptoms like headaches or nausea than to any sort of psychological or psychiatric emergency. However, in the weeks following the dosing day, we did have a few severe adverse events that related to suicidal ideation, and they were numerically more in the 25 milligram group. I do not think that we can draw much in way from inference from this because of the sample sizes in each arm. And I would say that from a clinical perspective, I feel that part of this may be that a lot of the frequency of the suicidal ideation were in non-responders to the 25 milligram dosing. And I feel that, again, expectancy may have played a role. The disappointment that, that the intervention did not lead to improvement may have led to a feeling of despair and suicidality. Again, it's just a hypothesis, and of course requires further assessment. So again, this is just data summarizing that. We had severe adverse events in 9% of the 25 milligram group, 7% in the 10, and 1 in the 1 milligram group. The serious adverse events were related to suicidal ideation and self-injury in both groups. And there were no serious adverse events in the 1 milligram group. So again, moving on from that study and into what we're conducting at our center, one of the main questions, and I'm at the ACNP meeting here, which is a large meeting in neuropsychopharmacology in North America. One of the main questions has been what is a key ingredient in the antidepressant mechanism of action for psilocybin? And one of the key questions has been, do we need the psychedelic experience? And that's important because the psychological support is quite resource intensive. 10 to 14 hours of psychological support from trained therapists could be a drain on a health service that is already strained. And so this is just some data from Scott Thompson's group in Colorado, looking at a preclinical mouse model of depression in which they blocked the psychedelic effect of psilocybin using ketanserin. And yet we're still able to show that in these mice, psilocybin induced an anti-anhedonic and perhaps antidepressant-like effect. Now, I know preclinical data doesn't often translate into humans, but I do think it's a valid scientific question. And so we at CAMH have been funded in the first federally funded clinical trial of psilocybin to address this question in humans, and we're conducting a proof of concept study to try and determine whether the subjective psychedelic effects of psilocybin mediate an antidepressant effect in patients with treatment-resistant depression. There are two schools of thoughts in this, I wouldn't say argument, but question. One group has felt that it's an essential component, and whereas others argue that perhaps it may not be. I will just say that I'm totally agnostic to this question, and as a scientist, I'm just curious to understand what's going on. And so we are conducting this proof of concept randomized control trial. What we're going to do is use risperidone at 1 milligrams, which has been shown in healthy volunteers to block the psychedelic effect of psilocybin. And what we want to do is to establish the feasibility and tolerability of that combination in patients with treatment-resistant depression. We want to try and find a signal to see if this combination blocks the psychedelic effects of psilocybin and provide any pilot data to see if there's any antidepressant effects of that combination compared to psilocybin by itself and to placebo. So this is our double dummy 3-arm trial design. We are using psilocybin 25 milligrams combined with risperidone 1 milligrams, psilocybin plus placebo, or placebo plus risperidone as our active placebo arm. All participants will be receiving at least 12 hours of psychological support, which is a precedent in trials of psilocybin at the moment to provide safety and monitoring. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm conscious that I only have 15 minutes. Essentially, we're trying to be as broad as we can in terms of our inclusion criteria, and our exclusion criteria are pretty standard. In order to enhance blinding, we are going to be restricting our sample to those that have had no prior experience with psychedelic drugs. And our primary outcomes is, of course, feasibility, but we're assessing psychedelic effects using the 5D ASC, as well as the Mystical Experiences Questionnaire, and antidepressant effects using the MATRIX. So in terms of the implications of this work, we appreciate that psilocybin-induced alterations in consciousness could be a barrier to widespread clinical adoption, and that the resource required could be quite costly, and we could perhaps simplify it if we show that psychedelic effects may not be required for the antidepressant effects. And we think that if our proof of concept trial shows that to be the case, Perhaps psilocybin combined with risperidone could be standardized and safely expanded without the need for intensive psychotherapy. This may accelerate clinical translation. For some people that are apprehensive about the psychedelic experience, it may increase social acceptance as well. But overall, I would say that there's growing evidence for the rapid and sustained antidepressant effects of psilocybin combined with psychological support. The treatment is a complex procedure. Patients have to be properly screened and prepared. There are lots of issues with the design of the current studies, and we do need further work. And we're excited at CAMH to be involved in this area and to continue to move the needle. Thank you very much. I will stop here because I understand my next presenter is going to speak and we will have a discussion thereafter.
That's right. Thank you so much, Dr. Husain. Our next presenter is Dr. Zach Walsh, who's a registered clinical psychologist, a professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia, and an affiliated scientist at the BC Centre on Substance Use, and most importantly, my supervisor. Take it away, Zach.
Oh, thanks so much. That was really, can you guys, do I sound okay? Oh, good. That was a great presentation. It's exciting to follow up on that, and also to follow up on Dr. Gobi's presentation from earlier just before this workshop. For those of you who saw that, a fascinating presentation on some preclinical animal research. So I have to apologize first of all, because originally I was going to talk a little bit about ketamine. And I think that may have influenced the title of this panel. But as I looked at what was on offer at the conference, I thought adding in microdosing might be more interesting and more appropriate, because I think it touches on a lot of the issues that have come up, and I guess complements them a little bit. So before I start, though, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from my home office in Kelowna, which is on the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples, and that's where I'm presenting from. And I think it's important as we talk about these medicines to, of course, acknowledge that they are indigenous technologies with a long history of use by the peoples primarily in Mexico and what's now Mexico. And of course, where our lineage comes from in understanding psilocybin is due largely to the generosity of Maria Sabina and the Zapotec healer who are Mazatec and Zapotec healer traditions who carried this through the Inquisition of the Americas and through some very difficult times, that we're able now to study these modalities. So I just want to acknowledge that. I also want to disclose that I've conducted paid clinical work with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. I worked on some early MAPS trials of MDMA, and I'm currently a therapist working on clinical trials of psilocybin. I'm on the advisory board of Numinus, Mycomedica, Entheotech, and MAPS Canada, all of whom are developing psychedelic psychotherapy options. I'm an advisor to Quantified Citizen, which is a data collection and research service I'm going to talk a little bit about today in the research. And my research is also funded broadly by the Tri-Council, SSHRC, CIHR, and MyTax as well. So with that in mind, a little bit of history, since we do acknowledge that the history going back to Mexico, but since here in North America, since the conference is being hosted a little bit by UBC, I like to mention that the first recorded use of psilocybin mushrooms outside of Mexico, or grown outside of Mexico anyways, perhaps people had brought them from Mexico, but for psilocybin grown outside of Mexico, the first documented use was on the UBC campus by, I think, by students who had been, and if there's any students today who are there, keep your eyes open, keep your eyes to the ground. You might never know what you might find as you walk through the campus, but apparently students who had gone to Mexico, I believe they were anthropology students who had gone to Mexico to see what was going on in Huitla with Maria Sabina, noticed similar looking mushrooms growing on the UBC campus and picked them, and sure enough, they were psilocybin mushrooms, Liberty caps, and word spread, and they were eventually confiscated. But this is the first documented case of the use of psilocybe mushrooms outside of that were grown outside of Mexico is on UBC. So just a little bit of historical trivia. Before I get into the core of the presentation, which is going to be on microdosing, and I think it's an interesting addition to the presentation by Dr. Husain, talking about the potential of non-transformative or non-psychedelic experiences. Do we need the psychedelic experience? And what I'm going to talk about today is some research that we've done on microdosing, which is by definition meant to be subsensorium. I don't know, there's controversy over whether it's in fact subsensorium or whether it's just subtle. I think, based on some of the research, which I'll review with you in just a moment, it looks like people can identify whether or not they're on, whether or not they are microdosing. So I don't know if it's quite subsensorium, but it's not meant to be cognitively impairing anyhow. The idea with microdosing is the dose is sufficiently small that people can engage in their normal day-to-day functioning without too much interference. Also typical of microdosing is successive self-administration. So unlike the single higher dose sessions or 2 high dose sessions separated by a few weeks, with microdosing, we typically see maybe a few days on, a few days off. There's a lot of different protocols. And that, that's part of what our research was trying to get at is what are the practices in the field, so to speak. But a lot of different protocols, but they tend to converge around, a couple times a week seems to be the standard. And predominantly in our study, we saw psilocybin as number 1, probably because a lot of our sample was in North America. If you go to Europe, I think LSD is more common, but in our sample is primarily psilocybin. That's what I'm going to talk about today. And typically it's about 0.1 to 0.3 grams of dried psilocybe mushrooms. And there's been, if you look at some of the references over the last 5 years, there's been a bit of an explosion, particularly over the last 3 years. I would say, a huge majority of the research on microdosing has been published in the last couple of years. So it's a growing field, but still a lot to learn. And I think, in contrast with the research that was just reviewed, great review of the high dose research, we see small, relatively smaller samples as is typical of clinical research, and a high degree of control. So there's placebo control. We're very specific about dosing, about the kind of therapy that people are receiving, the kind of support people receive. In the research that I'm going to present to you, it's just the opposite. So we have very large samples and very little control. And I think one of the things that's so neat about the conference today is we're getting to see all these different approaches to understanding psychedelics. We can see some of this preclinical work with mice, all the way to clinical work with humans, and now this kind of large cohort studies with very little control that I'm going to relate to you today. So in addition to microdosing, just another term before we get started on our results is stacking. So people are taking psilocybe mushrooms primarily, but they're also combining them. Over half of our sample was combining with things like cacao, chocolate, but also lion's mane and niacin seems to be a common combination. Also Syrian rue, which contains harmaloid alkaloids that can facilitate some of the perhaps some of the metabolism, the psilocybin. But lion's mane and niacin are the most common additions to the stack, and our research is the first to document that process. And there's a picture of lion's mane, such a neat looking mushroom. So if you look at the past research, just a broad overview, what do microdosers report? And as you can see, this is all done in the last few years. Reduced stress, improvements in mood, attenuation of depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD symptoms, lower levels of negative emotionality, higher positive mood. So we see both clinical measures of symptomology and also just affect in healthy normals. But of course, these are modest changes, and as was been presented in the prior presentation, we can't rule out the influence of placebo or expectancy effects, especially when we see these, subtle changes in mood. People are expecting that this is what's going to that this is what it's going to do, so we can't be too surprised if that's what happens. we do see some experimental work showing that these low doses, and I think in Dr. Gobi's presentation, with mice, it was also low dose. I don't know what kind of equivalence we can find for microdosing in mice, but the doses of LSD were what she described as being equivalent to very small, and seeing some direct neurochemical effects. And that's also what this review by my colleague, Dr. Kim Kuipers from Maastricht, also found. And Dr. Kuipers is a collaborator on some of the research that we're going to show right away from microdose.me. So with these concerns around potential expectancy effects, there's been some focus on that in the research and some really creative and interesting ways to get at it, but I don't think we've ruled out or ruled in placebo effects. So in this bottom study by the Imperial College team, positive expectations predict the outcomes with microdosing. So they found similar results to past studies of improved mood and mental health associated with microdosing, but it was when you counted for expectations, it reduced the size of the effects. However, the participants were not naive to microdosing. So, if there's individual differences in how people respond, which we might expect, especially at low doses like this, past experience could guide future experience. So it could be that people who had good experiences in the past or positive experiences in the past reasonably expected, due to legitimate non-placebo mechanisms, to have positive experiences again. So I'm not sure if partialing out expectations is the way to get at it, although it is I think a reasonable approach, but it is just a self-report of, do you expect this to work? Yes or no. In another prominent study that's also looked at the potential for expectancy or placebo effect. In this case, they had self-blinding studies. So people were, through a complex task, self-blinded, put their psilocybin in different capsules and then marked them with a QR code. And it was quite intricate and ingenious. But nonetheless, despite the effects of self-blinding, just about everyone guessed their condition, even with microdosing. So the limitations of placebo control in psychedelic research remain, whether it's low dose or high dose, certainly more pronounced at high dose. And I do wonder, perhaps for the discussion after, if we can talk about how important is it that we keep a placebo control? Is it even meaningful when you have over 90% of people guessing their condition? So on to our present study. One way we can start to add to this, even if we can't control for placebo, is by looking at large samples, and perhaps that provides an avenue for at least refining the findings, even if we can't entirely control for placebo. And so to do that, we used the Quantified Citizen app and the Microdose.me study, which is still running. We're in version 2 now. So this is 2.0, but the study allows people to report on a daily basis through sort of a ecological momentary assessment is something it's sometimes called, or daily diary is the old style. But it allows us to assess for the effects of microdosing and practices closer to the actual administration. So you don't have people looking back in time retrospectively, or as retrospectively at least. And what we have is, at the time of making this slide, over 13,000 participants, but it's far more now. So we have a lot of power and very little control. So a much different approach, but hopefully we can converge on some findings. So our first study, and again, in the last study, we saw some of the interest this is generating, and our study was also one of the most downloaded from Nature Scientific Reports, the first study. And this was a cross-sectional study that looked at differences amongst people who microdosed versus non-microdosers, and also looked at their motivations and practices. And what we see, as I mentioned, first of all, is that most people are using it 1 to 4 times per week. And that over half are stacking or combining psilocybin with other things, the most common one being that combination of lion's mane and niacin. And I'll get to some of those results in a moment. But first of all, just a basic question of, why are people doing this? And we were able, because of our large sample, to break it down amongst folks who reported mental health concerns and those who had no concerns. And a mental health concerns in this case was a diagnosis in the past of a mental health condition. And across the board, people are using microdosing to enhance mindfulness, to improving mood was more common amongst those with mental health concerns, and also decreasing substance use and decreasing anxiety were substantially more common motives amongst the mental health sample. Whereas enhancing creativity was more prominent, although not significantly so amongst the non-mental health group. And when you look at the effects, we see modestly lower levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, the subscales of the DAS measure that some of you might be familiar with, slightly lower levels amongst the microdosers. So again, this is cross-sectional and self-report, so some limitations into how we interpret this, but nonetheless, it certainly suggests that microdosers are not faring worse, that it's not somehow impairing well-being at least. So give us some confidence moving forward and perhaps the beginnings of a signal. So in the next study from the microdose.me data, we followed people for a month, and our sample size decreased somewhat, substantially, but nonetheless, we still allowed us to have a pretty large sample, so we could look at some more subgroups. And again, within the first, I think, few weeks of this study being out, it was downloaded over 130,000 times. So there's tremendous public interest in this research, and microdosing in particular seems to be really drawing a lot of attention. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to do this research, is not only to perhaps identify some promising treatments, but also to be able to speak to the safety and effects for people who are already doing this. So one thing about psychedelics is very different from a lot of other emerging pharmacotherapies where the therapy is not available. The cat is already out of the bag, and people are using this in the real world. We have, I think, a responsibility as scientists to be able to help them to determine how to do it safely, and if it's even possible to do it safely. So that is part of our goal. And what did we find? We found that and this is just psilocybin. So for the sake of clarity, we took out the other psychedelic microdosers because psilocybin was by far the most popular. And what we found was, everyone reduced the sort of practice effects or general effects of being part of a study like this. People tend to get better, but the microdosers got more better. They got better, they showed more dramatic decreases in stress, depression, and anxiety over the course of 1 month. And in some cases, the non-microdosers are pretty flat when it came to anxiety. But across the board, we saw these not insubstantial, small effect sizes, but not insubstantial. So, for some folks, it meant a 3 or 4 point drop on scales of depression, bringing them from moderate to mild depression, in some cases from the higher end of moderate to the lower end of moderate. And also for people who aren't suffering from more pronounced symptoms of mental health, we also saw mood increases. You see a greater increase in positive mood in microdosers compared to non, and a greater decrease in negative mood. And again, the placebo effect is possible, and you can't rule out expectancies. I wouldn't call it a placebo effect because no one's getting a placebo, but it could be an expectancy effect. One strength of this kind of research is we are able to control for the procedures. So there is an effect to just engaging in a study like this, reporting on your mood. Those kind of things can have an effect, but we do control for that because we have these non-microdosers who are going through all the same procedures. And I also think it's remarkable that in a study where we're not compensating participants and they're reporting fairly regularly, we were able to keep 180 people who weren't even microdosing, keep them in the study for a month. So certainly a lot of gratitude for the citizen scientists who participate in this research. And I just want to leave you with this one slide because I think it speaks to the potential of this kind of research, and also something that I'm skeptical about, but hearing about some of the work on increasing neuroplasticity and even some dendritic growth associated with psychedelics, it gives us at least some rationale of why we might see some of these more direct effects. And what we saw is, this is on the TAP test, which is a classic measure of psychomotor ability. And if you look at the top lines, those are the dotted line, those dotted lines, those are all the under 55s, and they're tapping in a regular rate. We don't see much difference amongst the different subgroups of microdosers. The bottom, the solid lines, are the over 55s, and that's where I think we would see enough potential variance where we would expect potential to see some gains associated with microdosing. And if you look at the green line, that is a group of 55 and older who are using the combination of psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin, and they show increases in the TAP test. Now, again, it is a small group. It's only 30 or so respondents. But compared to those who are microdosing psilocybin only, they show greater increases, and also greater increases in the non-microdosers. But it's I think a preliminary signal. We're right now trying to replicate it with a new sample, and if we do, then I'll be even more encouraged at the potential of microdosing to perhaps remedy some of the cognitive effects, psychomotor effects, anyways, associated with aging. And the TAP test has been identified as an early marker for Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative disorders. So it's an early signal and needs replication, and of course will need to be followed up with the kind of clinical trials that we saw before. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how this research can inform other approaches that are going to be more definitive. And certainly, when we look at how many 13,000 initial participants, we need that kind of power to get these initial signals, because at the end of the day, it's still only left us with 30 or so individuals who are using the combination of psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin who are over 55. So we need these huge samples to be able to look at the subgroups where we might see specific effects. And so, I think that the jury's still out, as it is with so much psychedelic research, but interesting signals coming from diverse places, I'd say, is the take-home message that I'll leave you with. And also, thanks to all of you for your attention, and to the organizers. If you want to chat with me, I'm easy to find. Shoot me an email, and I'm happy to discuss this in more detail. But now I'll just turn it back to Tatiana for discussion and questions.